Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really diving deep into some foundational stories.
That's right. We're looking at the book of Genesis, specifically chapters 1 and 2, the creation accounts.
Exactly. And we've got a stack of material here, scholarly analysis, historical context stuff, even a YouTube series outline someone pitched on this. Quite a mix.
And the idea is to, well, distill it for you, our listener. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding these texts.
Right. Because they've had such a huge impact, haven't they? On Western culture, thought, everything.
Absolutely. So clarity is the goal. Understanding the origins, the main themes, without getting totally bogged down.
And one of the first things you notice, which is kind of fascinating, is that there isn't just one creation story here.
No, there are two, right back to back.
You've got Genesis 1, which feels very grand, very cosmic. Scholars often call it the priestly account.
That's the one. And then right after, Genesis 2 gives us a much more sort of down-to-earth narrative feel. That's the Oistic account.
So we'll be exploring both, seeing what makes them tick and how they relate.
And, we can't really talk about these without mentioning the context. When and why were they written?
Good point. Our sources really stress thinking about the time of the Babylonian exile.
6th century BCE, that historical situation adds quite a bit of meaning, potentially, to how these stories were first heard and understood.
Okay, so let's start with Genesis 1 then. The big picture, the cosmic one. The structure alone is pretty remarkable.
It really is.
Yeah.
Laid out over 6 distinct days. Day 1, light. Day 2, sky, and so on.
Building block by block, leading up to the 7th day, the Sabbath, as a day of rest. It feels very deliberate, very ordered.
And a key theme is how God creates simply by speaking, let there be.
Yeah, let there be light, and boom, light. It's creation by divine word, bringing order out of, what the text describes as chaos or a watery void.
That emphasis on order is huge in this first account.
Yeah.
A very structured, almost architectural process, and God speaking it into existence. That underlines, immense power and purpose.
Definitely purposeful. Then we get to day 6 and the creation of humanity, verses 26 and 27. This is massive.
It is. The idea that humans are made in God's image.
Selinem is the Hebrew word, and likeness, demute.
Precisely. And then there's that interesting bit, let us make humankind. Our sources talk about what that us might mean.
Yeah, like, is it God talking to himself in a royal way? Or maybe addressing a heavenly court? Angels?
Or some even see it hinting at the later Christian idea of the Trinity. Lots of interpretive history there.
But the core idea is this unique status, right? Humans reflecting the divine somehow.
Exactly. It sets humanity apart within this creation account. What exactly image and likeness mean is debated intellect, morality, relationship. But it points to a special dignity.
Okay, now to really get what makes Genesis 1 special, our sources suggest looking at other ancient creation myths.
Good idea. The big one that always comes up is the Babylonian story, the Enuma Elish.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting comparing them.
You see some surface similarities, definitely. Like order coming from chaos, divine beings doing the creating.
But the differences are just stark, aren't they?
Absolutely. Genesis 1 is strictly monotheistic. One God, all-powerful, creating calmly by speaking.
Whereas Enuma Elish has, a whole bunch of gods?
A whole pantheon, yeah. And creation emerges from basically a violent conflict between them. Tiamat, Marduk. It's messy.
So different from the Genesis picture and connecting back to the history.
Yes, the Babylonian exile again. If the Israelites encountered the Enuma Elish story while in Babylon, and it was a central myth for the Babylonians, Genesis 1 reads powerfully as a counterstatement.
Like a theological argument.
You could say that. Asserting their God, Yahweh, is the true sovereign creator, not these warring Babylonian gods. It's an identity statement.
Our sources also mention another Mesopotamian one, the Atrahasis epic.
Briefly. It's interesting because it gives a different reason for humans being created.
What's that?
Basically, to do the hard labor the younger gods didn't want to do. To serve the gods' needs.
Wow. Again, such a contrast with Genesis, where humanity seems to have inherent value, made in God's image.
Precisely. And that leads to another key point in Genesis 1, the repeated phrase.
And God saw that it was good.
Exactly. After almost every creative act, it emphasizes this inherent goodness, this positive view of the created world. It wasn't an accident or a byproduct of conflict. It was intended, and it was good.
Okay, so that's the grand, orderly picture of Genesis 1. Now let's shift gears to chapter 2.
Right, and the shift is immediate. The tone, the style, the focus, it all changes.
It feels much more like a story, a narrative. Less cosmic, more personal.
Definitely more personal. And God's portrayal changes too. Much more anthropomorphic, described using human-like actions.
Like the Hebrew word used, yatsar, meaning formed or shaped.
Yes, like a potter shaping clay. It's a very hands-on image of God. Very different from the transcendent God of Genesis 1 who just speaks things into being.
It really is. And this difference in style and portrayal is a big part of that scholarly idea you mentioned earlier.
The documentary hypothesis, yeah. It suggests these different styles point to different original sources within the Israelite tradition that were later combined. Genesis 2 is often linked to the Yahwistic or J source, generally considered older.
Okay, got it. And here in Genesis 2, we get the creation of the first human, Adam, verse 7.
And it's fascinating, the wordplay there. Adam, the human, is formed from the Adamah, the ground or earth.
Highlighting that connection, our earthly origins.
And then God breathes the breath of life into his nostrils. A very intimate, direct act of giving life.
That's a powerful image, the divine breath.
It really is, underscoring that close connection, that divine spark.
Then we get the Garden of Eden, this paradise setting.
And Adam is placed there. The sources highlight, of course, two famous trees.
The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Which some read is maybe the tree of consciousness or moral awareness. It's complex.
And Adam gets a job to work and keep the garden.
Right, a mandate, but also a prohibition.
The big one, don't eat from the tree of knowledge.
Sets up the whole drama, doesn't it? Questions about choice, limits, obedience, it's all there.
And then, crucially, the creation of Eve, Genesis 2.18 onwards.
God says it's not good for the man to be alone, so the focus shifts to relationship, companionship.
And Eve is formed from atoms. It's often translated rib, right? The Hebrew word zela.
It is, though zela can also just mean side. And how you interpret that has led to a lot of discussion over the centuries.
Our sources mention that, yeah. Does it imply partnership, fundamental unity? Or has it been used to argue for male dominance or a hierarchy?
Both interpretations exist and have had historical influence, but the text's stated reason is companionship, a helper corresponding to him or fit for him.
So the emphasis seems to be on relationship connection.
Very much so. Genesis 2 is deeply focused on relationships. God and human, human and human, human and the earth.
Okay, so putting these side by side, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, clearly different takes on creation.
Undeniably. Different styles, different orders of events, different ways of talking about God.
And the natural question, which our sources definitely anticipate listeners asking, is just why? Why have both?
And that historical critical approach offers a compelling explanation. Different sources, likely from different times or communities within ancient Israel.
The priestly source for chapter 1, the Yahwistic for chapter 2?
Generally, yes.
Nice.
And later editors, perhaps priests or scribes, decided to preserve both traditions, weaving them together at the start of their sacred texts.
It's helpful to just quickly recap the main contrasts our sources highlight.
Sure. Style. Genesis 1 is structured, repetitive, almost liturgical. Genesis 2 is a flowing narrative.
Focus. Cosmic scale in 1 versus a very human-centered story in 2.
Order of creation. Plants, then animals, then humans last in chapter 1. But in chapter 2, man is created first, then the garden, then animals, then woman.
And God's portrayal. Transcendent, distant, creating by word in 1 versus imminent, hands-on, walking in the garden in 2.
Those are the big ones. Quite a contrast list.
So why keep both? What purpose could combining them serve?
Well, the sources suggest maybe they addressed different needs or questions within the community. Perhaps Genesis 1, emphasizing God's absolute power and the goodness of creation, was vital during that Babylonian exile we keep mentioning.
Right, a reassurance when everything seemed chaotic and foreign gods seemed dominant.
Exactly. While Genesis 2, focusing on the covenant relationship, the land, the garden, human responsibility, might have spoken more to life within the promised land, or perhaps reflected older traditions about origins.
Combining them gives a richer, more layered picture.
A more complete theology, perhaps, addressing both God's universal sovereignty and God's intimate relationship with humanity and the land.
And that link back to the exile context for Genesis 1 seems really strong. A polemic, you said, against Babylonian ideas.
It certainly reads that way, asserting Yahweh's sole power against the backdrop of myths like Enuma Elish, declaring this is how the world really began, this is who is truly in charge.
A way of maintaining identity and faith while in exile.
A powerful way. And maybe also a critique of some Canaanite nature god worship too, by emphasizing Yahweh as distinct from and master over nature.
So for those first hearers or readers, these weren't just quaint old stories.
Not at all. They were, as the sources stress, Foundational statements of faith. Yahweh is the creator. We are made in God's image, giving us dignity. And those other gods, not the real deal.
It was theology, identity, and polemic all rolled into one.
Providing an anchor in turbulent times, connecting them to their heritage and their God.
Okay, let's tackle the authorship question. Who actually wrote Genesis?
The million-dollar question. Traditionally, of course, the answer was Moses.
Based on other parts of the Bible and long-standing religious tradition.
Right, that's the traditional view. But modern biblical scholarship, for the last couple of centuries really, has developed a different perspective.
This is the documentary hypothesis again, JEPD sources.
That's the dominant scholarly model, yes. Proposing multiple authors or schools of authors writing and editing over many centuries, not just one person.
And the evidence against Moses writing it all. Our sources mention things like anachronisms.
Yes, details that seem out of place for Moses' time, like mentioning the Philistines, who historically arrived later, or place names that weren't known then.
Plus the different styles we've already talked about between Genesis 1 and 2.
And the way themes in, say, the priestly source seem to fit so well with the concerns of the Babylonian exile period, long after Moses.
So, the scholarly consensus leans away from single Mosaic authorship for Genesis as we have it.
That's fair to say, though the traditional view is still held by many religious communities.
And how does this authorship question affect how people read it?
Well, if you believe Moses wrote it under divine inspiration, you might read it more as a direct historical account from that earliest period of Israel's history. If you accept the multiple source view, you might see it more as a text that reflects Israel's evolving understanding of God and their relationship with God over centuries, drawing on ancient traditions, but shaping them to speak to new situations.
So it affects the interpretation. And our sources briefly mention different ways people read Genesis today.
Yeah, literal interpretations, seeing it as factual history and science, metaphorical readings, looking for symbolic or theological truths rather than literal ones, and historical critical readings, like we've been discussing, focusing on the text development and original context.
Lots of different approaches. Okay, so stepping back, what are the big theological or philosophical takeaways from Genesis 1 and 2?
Well, number one, undeniably, is monotheism. One God, the source of everything. That's foundational.
Absolutely. And then?
The idea that creation isn't random or chaotic, but ordered and purposeful. Especially clear in Genesis 1, but Genesis 2 also shows God acting with intention.
Right. And we keep coming back to the status of humanity.
The dignity of being made in God's image. That's a profound statement about human value, regardless of which account you're focused on.
At our role, what are we supposed to do in this creation?
Genesis 1 uses words often translated as dominion and stewardship, a sense of responsibility to care for the earth.
While Genesis 2 seems to emphasize relationship more.
Yes, the responsibility that comes with relationship to God, to each other, to the garden, the environment. Slightly different nuances, but both point towards human responsibility within creation.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up for our listeners. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. So the takeaway is that Genesis 1 and 2, though different, together give us this foundational picture in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
A picture of God the Creator, humanity's special place, and the nature of the world itself.
And understanding their likely historical context, especially that Babylonian exile period, really helps unlock what these stories might have meant to their first audience. They weren't written in a vacuum.
Yeah, that context seems key. It helps explain the contrasts, the emphases, even maybe why both accounts were kept.
It illuminates their original purpose and power for that ancient Israelite community.
All right, so here's a final thought, something maybe to mull over. How might really grappling with the historical background and the literary differences between Genesis 1 and 2, how might that change how we approach modern debates?
Debates about what? Creation? Science?
Yeah, or humanity's role regarding the environment, or even just the nature of religious texts and faith itself.
That's a great question. Does understanding where these texts came from and why they might have been written shift how we apply them or think about them today?
Something to consider. How these ancient, powerful stories continue to speak, maybe in different ways once we understand their origins a bit better.
It invites a deeper engagement, doesn't it? Thinking about their ongoing significance.
Definitely. A lot to think about there.